So, okay, we're going into our next panel discussion, and this is a huge topic, obviously, electrification. And there are so many different angles and dimensions to this massive transition toward electric mobility. And that's why I'm really happy to have Alex Mitchell moderating this panel. Alex is Senior Vice President for Unlocking Innovation at the Los Angeles Cleantech Incubator. There he's responsible for all of the founder-facing activities. Before coming to LACI, Alex was the VP for Strategy at PSA in Paris. PSA is Peugeot Citroën, one of the largest European OEMs. Before that, he was a good and amazing colleague of mine at the World Economic Forum. And my gosh, it keeps going back. We were with Coda and McKinsey and he went to Stanford, right? I think we've heard of that. I think I've heard of that place in California. Yeah. Okay. So it's fantastic to have Alex take us through this topic. Alex, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. So as John said, I work at Los Angeles Cleantech Incubator. We are an incubator and investor in cleantech, but one of those three priority spaces is really zero emissions mobility, including the battery economy. So we've been at it for a while. Companies like FreeWire, which is an EV manufacturer, Ampere, which is an electric hybrid plane manufacturer, and a EV fleet management company called the Ampli, which is now known as BP Pulse. John made me promise that we wouldn't get into like nerd talk right away. We would give a little bit of preamble. So what I want to talk about here is like really this electrification of transportation with sort of some exceptions maybe around bicycles and sailboats. Like historically for the last century, almost all forms of transportation, whether you're talking about surface transportation or maritime or aviation, are fueled by some form of fossil fuel. And what we're beginning to see is that shift towards electrons for a lot of those form factors. And it's starting right now with the very tiny form factors. So you're seeing the bike market being just going absolutely gangbusters with electric bikes. You're seeing passenger cars start to tip towards electrification. So right now in California, we're just a hair under about 20% of all new cars sold being electric. And you're starting to see it touch like the bigger form factors, which would be like heavy duty trucks, some on the maritime, some of the smaller boats, and even aviation. So that's what we're talking about, is sort of this replacement of all across all form factors of transportation, this moving away from fossil fuels, which we've been doing for the last roughly century, and moving towards electrons. And so what we'll talk about today is like, what are the drivers of this shift and what are some of the barriers? And I feel really grateful to have Stephen, Juan, Trent, and Milo on the panel here. What I want each of you to do is just give a 1-minute overview of what your org does in that sort of electrification shift. Want to start?
Sure. So my name is Stephen Kaye. I'm the CTO of RNext Energy, and we are a battery pack manufacturer for electric vehicles. We have products coming onto the market in both the class 3 to 6 trucks, so small delivery vans, trucks, etc., and the passenger vehicle space. My background has been in developing materials and materials-enabled technologies for the energy space pretty much my whole career. Started off in hydrogen storage, actually at MIT in undergrad. And then got into battery materials development at a startup, Wildcat Discovery Technologies, and then moved to Apple, where again worked on battery technologies for larger applications, and then joined Juan about a year ago.
Trent Mell, I'm founder and CEO of Electra Battery Materials. So an unlikely start as an attorney, M&A, corporate finance. 15 years in global mining around the world, all commodities, and then a few years ago started Electra. So Electra's, our role really is, we're the front end of the onshoring of the auto supply chain. So if you look at mines and mining and mineral processing, all that's geared towards alloy and metal industry. We need to convert our minerals into a chemical form, sulfates, for inclusion in the battery. So our job is to take those minerals in, convert them, and then we hand them off to the precursor and the cathode makers for eventual inclusion in the battery.
Cool. I'm Milo, Werner, general partner at the Engine. The Engine invests in early stage founders solving the world's greatest challenges through the convergence of breakthrough science, leadership, and engineering. And so we have a number of investments in the EV space. I also spent 8 years at Tesla. I ran new product introduction for them, which is the launch up and ramp of all products for the company.
Hello everyone, my name is Juan Macias. I'm the CEO of a company called AlphaStruxure. So we're in the infrastructure business. So we design, build, own, and operate behind the meter energy systems. And in the context of the conversation today, that would be a conversion of a depot, could be public or private depot, that's moving from diesel to electric or fuel cell. And to one of our topics, we deliver an integrated solution. So the charging infrastructure and charge management, all the solar generation, storage, all of that through a long-term power purchase agreement where we own it, we maintain it, we address the points that were brought up in the earlier discussion during the topic. Great to be here.
Great, thank you all so much. One of the first things I want to dive into is the supply chain. You could argue that sort of in North America, the supply chain for vehicle electrification is, arguably maybe a decade behind China, arguably maybe a half a decade behind Europe, or put another way, we do not have in the U.S. today an extremely robust R&D competency for batteries and manufacturing competency for batteries in the way that China and to a lesser extent Europe does. But there's a big shift in Washington. We've had 3 landmark bills turn into legislation, so the Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's very clear that the focus of those bills, one of them, is making sure that we actually have a viable North America supply chain from the R&D and manufacturing perspective. Stephen and Juan, I would love to just hear from you about how big that challenge is to actually build a viable, credible, let's call it battery supply chain in North America for vehicle electrification, and what are some of the biggest challenges you see? Maybe Trent, you want to go first?
Yeah, the challenge is, as you put it, China 10 years ahead of us. And so Belt and Road, through that initiative, they've got very strong control over some of the biggest mines in the world. Africa, of course, being front and center there, Indonesia as well. So that's a huge challenge. And then from where we sit, we're on the processing side, 80% of minerals are processed for EVs in China as well. IRA is a huge boom. That's going to spur a big investment cycle. Why? Because cost of capital for a company in China is effectively zero. Cost of capital for a company like ours is probably 10, 15, 17%, depending on your resources. Capital formation for what we're doing, which is long lead, capital intensive, not sexy, it's high. And the IRA, what that's done is it's created some opportunities. It's accelerating discussions that we've had with OEMs and their entire supply chain. We've got a 3-year partnership with LG Energy Solution. They'll be buying 60% of our production. But we're the first in our space. We need 8 more companies like us to get there. I think you're going to see a huge investment cycle on the chemical process side over the next 3-4 years.
Yeah, I would very much echo that. We've seen the IRA has really amplified the interest in localization or North American supply chain. Our company was, one of our founding principles was to build a North American supply chain for batteries. And we had a lot of interest from OEMs in that, but the uptick once the IRA was passed was astonishing. It is definitely a big lift. As you said, the supply chain, there used to be a small supply chain for batteries in the US, but it all basically disappeared over the last 10 years as as everything moved to China. And it's going to be a lot of work, and a lot of companies are going to have to start and scale in order to get that in place here. That said, the IRA is actually designed kind of nicely in that regard, where there's a escalating series of
Domestic content rules.
Content rules where if you can, you get some incentive if you can get the material from a free trade country, greater incentive if you can get it from North America. It scales over time, and so we and I think most companies are basically pursuing a strategy where you start off getting as much of your material as you can from free trade countries, and then ramp the amount of North American supply as as these new plants, new companies get up and running.
Question, just another angle to the IRA. So as we get scaling in manufacturing or production and scaling in just the overall fleet conversions, there are very important parts of the IRA that are also geared at scaling the energy infrastructure. So I think those are, whether it's microgrids, ITC tax credit for solar. So I think some very important elements of the IRA are also addressing that, because that has to scale material.
Yeah, well, on the topic, let's talk about the charging infrastructure. We're obviously gearing up towards ever greater proliferation of passenger cars being powered by electrons, medium-duty trucks, heavy-duty trucks. Milo and Juan, I would love to just hear, what do you see as sort of in the charging infrastructure side, whether it's driven by the IRA, driven by technology developments, whatever else? We're seeing a proliferation of different business models, different ways of approaching this solution. Sort of, what is your organization working on? Also, what do you see as sort of the leading edge and the things to keep an eye on?
Yeah. Couple pieces. One, we see a lot of innovation both in the technology, but also in the way the capital structures are being, the capital stacks being formed. And I think this is across the entire climate spectrum, is that we're seeing a lot more diversification of how people are building their capital stack. So that's super exciting, because it means you can go farther with less. On the technology side, I don't think that there is a tier one who has really mastered the energy management, either on the charging side or on the vehicle side, right? Pretty much everybody does their own thing, or they cobble together some pieces, right? There's a lot there to be kind of evolved in, so I think we see a lot of technology development in that space.
Look, what I would highlight is one, demand, right? So all of these sectors grow in manufacturing and the conversion of all vehicle types are driving up demand. So demand has been fairly steady in the U.S. electric demand, and over the next 10 years it'll double, and over the next decade after that it'll double. So we need to scale both at utility scale and also decentralization of energy networks, microgrids. So in order to help in that, what we do in AlphaStruxure, we bring a business model innovation in terms of energy as service. And what that means is that we can build decentralized energy systems with zero capex to the customer, and basically a volumetric charge to the customer for using the energy. And we do that through a long-term power purchase agreement. And we underwrite the risk of the construction, the risk of the operations and maintenance. So this is another tool that both public and private customers have in order to be able to deploy the objectives that they have in terms of scaling their fleets, or for that matter, in scaling their production processes.
Stephen, I want to go back to something you were just touching on, which is slightly pivot on you talked about the IRA, the sort of content requirements, domestic, free trade agreement, et cetera. One of the maybe things that's in there is also recognized is getting credit for recycling batteries sort of counts as the same thing as domestic production. And I think it's a recognition in the Inflation Reduction Act that North America is not particularly blessed with as much mineral abundance as Indonesia, DRC, Australia, Southern Latin America, you name it. We've got probably Canada's more blessed than the US, but either way you look at it, North America is not the most mineral blessed region of the world. And yet there's this opportunity, even today, if you take the amount of smartphones in circulation, 10-year-old Nissan Leafs, and obviously it just continues to scale as we go forward, the amount of sort of end of life in automotive application, potentially, batteries that will need to be treated and thought through how do we recycle or repurpose instead of just putting into a landfill. Can you two talk about sort of what you see as the leading edge today in terms of recycling, remanufacturing, reuse of either, in the upstream of processing all the way down through the downstream of actual used applications?
Yeah, so in terms of what I've seen, the main, so the larger players in this battery recycling space are all big commercializing chemical processes to take the the materials in the pack and drive them back to metal so that they can be reused as fresh raw materials. That absolutely works, but the economics only pencil out for the more expensive components. So copper, nickel, cobalt works great. When you get to things like iron, the aluminum foils, it's the graphite that's either can't be done or just is particularly difficult economically. So what some people are starting to look at, including us, is how do we do reuse? How do we take these packs that at the end of life actually have still quite a bit of energy or even decent state of health left in them, and use them? And that's really about making it so that the refurbishment of the pack is as cheap as possible. Right now, all the end-of-line collection, end-of-line testing, etc., is very expensive relative to the cost of a new pack. But if you have better informatics, if you can track the performance of that pack over its life, and so have an updated battery management model, cell model at the end, then you can reduce that refurbishment cost and get something that can go into grid, home backup, other applications, which really significantly boost the value of the pack.
Yeah. So do you think that gives like a pretty clear arbitrage opportunity to auto manufacturers who are going to be the ones who probably know most about that battery state of health vis-a-vis their dealers and consumers, a third party who wants to try to monetize that battery?
It could be the auto OEM, it could be the pack manufacturer. It's whoever's going to have access to the sensor data you put into that pack and own the models on the cell.
Okay. Trent, love to hear from you about like the sort of state of the art in terms of recycling.
That's its own panel or half day, but anything that Stephen can't turn into a second life battery, we could process. But you made an important point. There's two dominant types of cathodes out there. There's the nickel-rich NCM, NCA batteries, and then there's the LFP, the cheaper, this is a big China battery type, lithium iron phosphate. There's nothing in there of economic value for us to take back. So cheaper battery, huge ESG problem. But the nickel-rich cathodes that are out there today, there is got to be a couple of dozen, mostly private companies in America that do the shredding. But 90% of that material they produce, called the black mass, ends up at a smelter north of Toronto called Glencore. They've got a smelter there. They process the majority of that in a pyrometallurgical process. So back to ESG, it's a heat-based treatment. The graphite is lost, that's fuel. Lithium, they don't recover. They're targeting the main metals, nickel, copper, primarily in the cobalt. Ourselves, Retrieve Technology, Lifecycle, and a few others are going to the hydrometallurgical process. So you take that black mass, you put it into a solution, it's a chemistry set. Near zero emissions, we're on a hydroelectric grid, so the ESG really comes into the fore. We get the graphite out, we also get the lithium. You make a point, manganese, it's not worth recovering, so there's an economic loss there. But it's a fascinating sector. We're probably scaling up a little too quickly. But I do think it'll come of age in the next 5 to 10 years, and I think the model is going to be recycling as a service, because I don't think the battery makers are going to want to let that material go, only to have to repurchase it after the fact.
Wait, can I ask a question? How do you think about you said in the next 5 to 10 years, and then how do you think about, the life of a battery is, in a car, is like 8 to 10 years. It's pretty long.
Yeah, so there's three batches of material. Today it's all the portable electronics, whether it be tools and phones and laptops, and that's what we're all kind of chasing, and it's high cobalt, which is the high value, so it's a great area to experiment. Second phase are all these cell plants that are coming on stream in 2025.
Yeah.
You can have up to 10% material waste, scrap material, so that's the next wave, and then thereafter it'll be on the market.
Yeah, because if you think 10 years from now, what do we have, 2% EVs on the road or so? Like, it's pretty,
Still small.
it's pretty light.
Yeah.
I think, piggyback on your comment, in large form factor, heavy-duty vehicles, transit vehicles, where the battery pack is quite large. So the second life of that is taking a container and then you slide that pack right into a container, and we have a fixed storage. So, the owner of that particular fleet can then have a second use case for fixed energy storage for that asset.
Yeah, and the physical conversion of those packs into trailers for grid is relatively straightforward, but you've got to have the cell model. Otherwise, you're going to have to do a whole set of testing, and it's expensive.
Yeah. So So it's an interesting
Yeah.
application.
Well, you just mentioned heavy duty, and I want to actually talk about like where we go 5 to 10 years from now, particularly probably like 10 years from now. 10 years ago, there was still some folks saying, oh, there's a role for hydrogen in passenger cars. I think that chapter's largely been closed, although some might say otherwise. But we're at a point where if you look at China, you look at Europe, you look at North America, battery electric is clearly winning the war for e-bikes, or the bikes, let's call it. It's winning the war for passenger cars, but you've got a bunch of other vehicle form factors that are much harder to decarbonize. What's your prognosis, Juan, for 2030 in terms of bigger vehicles like heavy-duty trucks, short-haul aviation? Are we setting ourselves up for a potential VHS versus Betamax war on some of those form factors, or where do you think it goes in 10 years?
Look, I think it's use case specific. So I'll give you. I think it's best to give you an example, right? So just this week on Monday, we did an inauguration of in Montgomery County, Maryland, where the client converted their first depot all electric, right? And so we're beginning the second depot, and in that depot, it is going to be a blend. So it'll be half fuel cell hydrogen vehicles, and half will be electric. And the reason they made that decision is range, right? So a number of the routes that they run are beyond 150 miles, and so the range these vehicles go every day. And so I think it's an and, right? A use case specific decision in the large vehicle class that'll be there. Some of it, the range thing will be addressed by in-route charging by some it'll be with hydrogen.
And how do you think about sort of providing that customer with future proofing, right? They say, hey, our duty cycle has changed over the last 5 years, or even the state of the art has changed, and now we're looking at a hydrogen versus electron that's maybe more 2/3, 1/3. How do you sort of envision helping customers with that infrastructure issue?
Oh, look, it'll to produce green hydrogen, right? So you got to have green energy, right? And that can come through on-prem solar. It can come through a fuel cell with natural gas or renewable natural gas. Etc., or come from the utility. So I think you can, if that mix changes over time, you can still leverage the green energy and redirect that from going directly into the electrolysis process to going into the charging infrastructure directly. So I think there is a degree of flexibility that you can have as well.
Question for you on chemistry. If we get to 2030 and we're at, Bloomberg NEF would say 25% penetration, whatever that is. The mineral intensity for an automotive fleet is massive, right? Does it make sense to use that more expensive chemistry, the nickel-rich cathode in grid storage, or would you see us migrating to something that might be heavier and cheaper to put together?
In grid storage,
Grid.
it depends on the application, on the use case.
I don't think you're going to hit the cost points with the nickel rich on grid.
Yeah.
It's if you look at like the dollar per kilowatt hour on the LFP chemistries versus the NCM, it's not. It's continuing to diverge. So I'd be really surprised if you saw the nickel rich on more cost sensitive applications.
And yet that's what utilities are playing with, right? I'm on the board utility, we're playing with nickel-rich cathodes, and I say great, but I don't think that's where the world's going to go. It's way too expensive.
Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of interest on the LFP as well. But
Milo, you guys at the Engine, you're a deep tech investor. What are your thoughts on sort of some of these harder to decarbonize form factors, whether it's aviation, maritime, heavy-duty trucking?
Yeah, I was going to ask when you said everybody thinks there might be some hydrogen in the heavy duty haul, and I think we're a little bit torn whether it's going to be hydrogen or ammonia. So we've been looking at a lot of technologies that can translate hydrogen into ammonia, because I think there's been some discussion. I'm definitely not the expert in this space, but some discussion around what does long duration hydrogen storage look like? Is it possible? No, when I say long duration, I'm just saying when you generate that hydrogen from excess electricity generation on the grid, and you put it into hydrogen, then to convert it into ammonia, then to convert it back to hydrogen, and then back to electricity. You've lost any kind of value at all in that. So like, we might figure out the hydrogen storage strategy, but we might end up just going to ammonia, right? And going right from ammonia into long haul vehicles.
I kind of imagine if you can get the hydrogen to ammonia conversion cheap enough to make it work for that, you've also just solved the fertilizer problem.
Yeah.
Like,
There's
which
a
is
lot of
already
other markets that
massive.
get very excited about that.
The use, the demand,
Oh,
the demand.
Yeah.
What's that, like 1 or 2% of global CO2 emissions is the ammonia production?
Yeah, it's really big. So I think we've been having debate whether it's hydrogen or ammonia. I know the shipping category feels like the energy density for hydrogen just is way too.
Yeah.
Even for shipping.
Well, the big container ships just totally turn their nose up at it.
Yeah. And so you don't think necessarily, you're viewing maritime, for example, as a trade-off between hydrogen and ammonia, more likely to go ammonia, and not even necessarily a role for electrons, battery.
I don't think we see a role for electrons in heavy long haul,
Yeah.
whether it be in maritime or trucking.
Yeah. And then what about aviation?
Oh, there's been some interesting work done on like shorter duration or shorter flights, because the energy storage, how do I explain this? When you're dealing with the FDA, you have to have a certain amount of energy capacity on board to deal with an emergency landing, right? And so that makes the requirements of energy you have to have on board dramatically higher. If you start looking at these ground wind effect startups that are flying along the sea, you need dramatically less energy to do that because you can just land anywhere theoretically. And thus, I think the electric flight makes more sense. I think we're going to see planes go a different direction.
Yeah, I think we're looking at a future where short haul is powered by something vastly different than long haul, and short haul may very well be electric, and long haul may be one of those sustainable aviation fuels / something else sort of solution.
I also don't think we just have the natural resources to pick one solution.
Yeah. Well, okay, so that's maybe a great next question, right? We've got all these pressures coming from, including from the policy side, to say, okay, rapid decarbonization of the transportation sector. But we've already seen over the last 18 months any number of sort of choke points where demand was vastly greater than supply, and that was even ignoring things like domestic content production, whatever else. It was truly just for chips reasons, for supply chain fluctuations. There were real choke points in actually meeting the vehicle electrification demand. I would love for the four of you to sort of project through for the next 10 years. Are our goals reasonable, or are we going to have real choke points because there's simply not enough of X at X stage to do what we need, whether it's mining, processing, remanufacturing, you name it. I mean, a great example is just the amount of batteries that consumers psychologically want in their vehicles. Has us going towards a 300 to 500 mile range. That's sort of well beyond the sort of 30 to 40 miles people drive a day. So we're paying a pretty big psychological tax there on people's desires for a long stated range. Which may end up in a choke point later on where we're like, look, we just don't have enough batteries to power all these EVs. Where do you see as those choke points happening over the next 10 years? Steven, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, at least in the battery supply chain, there's just going to be a whole series of choke points around the raw materials for the cathode and anode, actual cell production, and we're seeing it now. If assuming the EV demand continues to move apace, a massive amount of infrastructure needs to be built. That said, it's a huge market opportunity, right? Like it's a competitive market. Prices spike up when the supply becomes constrained, and then new entrants come in, and I think we'll see that where there's going to be a lot of oscillation in prices, but it's what'll drive the continued massive investment in the space, and that's how we'll get there. One thing I would comment on this idea of a psychological tax, like as much as people do, like most trips are a short short distance, and so technically you're not using most of the battery in your vehicle. The user experience penalty for your car not being able to go the distance you want when you need it is really massive, because we don't have an easy way to go get another car to take that trip. And so I think at least as long as we have personally owned vehicles, you do actually, it's not just consumers making logical choices, it's the way our entire transportation infrastructure is set up. You really do need that ability to go that long range on occasion. Imagine if we move into like an autonomous vehicles and everybody has access to shared rides, et cetera, maybe that goes away, but I think that's a longer time horizon than the time we have to decarbonize the fleet.
Trent?
Yeah, if I go way, way back to 2017, cathodes back then, it was, the Western vehicle, it was a third nickel, a third cobalt, and a third manganese. But then cobalt spiked up to an all-time high. We saw images of children in Congolese mines, and it fostered, it accelerated innovation that was probably going to happen anyway towards batteries that just have a heck of a lot more nickel, 80, 90, 93% nickel content at the expense of the other two metals. And it's a better battery, but there were some engineering trade-offs, safety issues that we needed to overcome. And I think so we're going to have choke points. I mean, right now, the material we produce ultimately for North American vehicles is going to have to get processed in Japan for the next couple of years, because we're building a whole new supply chain and pieces are coming on stream at different times. But I think the next big innovation that I see is lithium metal and what that would do to a battery. Half the materials, double the range. It's a bit of a holy grail. It's got its own series of challenges that are way above my pay grade. But yeah, despite all the bumps, I think the biggest issue we're going to have is the raw materials. Everything else is bricks and mortars, permits, yes, and social acceptability. But the NIMBYism that we see in North America is still alive and well. It's getting better. But we could increase our own reliance here, self-sufficiency on, 20, 30% of our mineral needs for electric vehicles, if we were prepared to mine. And even our policy, IRA, assumes the metals fall out of the sky, and then it'll help everything go in the vehicle. So there's a social issue there and a long lead, but everything else I think is mixable.
Wait, so was your answer lithium?
An answer lithium metal. Some people might challenge me on that if we can get there.
Yeah. I think, first of all, we love this question because this is the place where we want to invest. So anybody who's got any interesting ideas on this, bring them on. I think we do see a huge shortage in lithium coming down the pipeline. Just we have an investment in Lilac Lithium, and the rate of change that we're seeing happen at the lithium industrial producers is so slow. It is hard to imagine that they are going to be able to ramp up, right? The process of extracting lithium right now is you pump out some salty brine, you put it in a pond for 12 months, and then you ship it off to China for processing, right? It is like, it's ages. So I think we're excited to see some evolution there, but it's not happening fast enough, for sure.
Different angle, I go back to the infrastructure, the scale. Right? I mean, when you look at medium and heavy duty vehicles, right, that come home to some sort of depot, 11 million in the U.S., right? So the scale to build out the infrastructure to bring those electrons to charge all those vehicles, the skill sets, the people, the contractors, just the scale of that amount of work is significant, right? I mean, we have a lot of these objectives by 2030, right? That's 8 years away. That's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right? And then the final one would be, regulatory. We have a lot of regulation around infrastructure that was put in place in a different era with different issues. So we need to really make adjustments to that regulatory environment around energy and construction and other areas to enable what needs to happen over the next, by 2030 and 2040. Or else it's wishful thinking.
By the way, I do want to ask one or two questions to the audience, so please think of what you would want to ask this panel. But I've got one final one for the four of you, which is, embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act is this notion of a domestic supply chain. Up until now, the EV market has been extremely global, right? The metals mined in Congo might go to China for processing, get put in a battery pack in South Korea, final assembly in North America, that sort of a global structure. Obviously, regions are moving towards self-sufficiency, but from a geopolitical perspective, is that also going to come basically in the form of a cold trade war, if you will, right? Where basically China and whatever its sort of economic interest touch is off limit to Europe and North America. Similarly, Europe sort of saying, you saw it actually last week after the Paris Auto Show where the Chinese automakers had a big showing. France and Germany sort of saying, hey, we need to sort of take a look at this free rider problem that both China and the US are pulling on Europe when it comes to the EV market. Are we basically entering sort of a cold trade war where there'll be 3 or so spheres of influence and things that had previously been accessible and available in North America, whether they came from China or elsewhere, are just sort of off limits?
Absolutely. We're there. The
Yeah.
Cold War is here now. My conversations start with the OEM, and then they go to the battery maker, the cathodes, and to some extent the miners. We're not all at the same table, but the OEMs are now driving the conversation. And the imperative to get out of China ASAP is palpable. And the IRA is driving that. So that was always part of the plan. And so a little company like Electra, we're tiny, little company like Electra, we're on a whiteboard of a lot of OEMs, and well, geez, we need you to do that, but can you do these other 7 things? I said, well, sure. I spent a lot of money and 4 times the staff. But the IRA's impact is gonna really accelerate things. I don't quite know how we get there. I mean, it comes to scale, right? Scale and timelines and all that. But everybody knows the Koreans and the Japanese that are huge partners in the supply chain. They know they've got to undo that supply chain. And there's a huge amount of lobbying going on in DC right now to try to slow the bus down so that we could get all these pieces in place.
Right. Okay. Well, new cold trade war. Here we are. Want to ask 1 or 2 questions to the crowd, so raise your hand and maybe just identify what org you're from and what your question is. There we go.
Chris Atkinson, U.S. Department of Transportation. There's a long preamble because there's always a long preamble. The average household income in the United States is $61,000 per year. The average new vehicle cost as of this month is $47,000 per year. The average new electric vehicle cost in the US as of last month was $65,000 a year. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is we are leaping from internal combustion engine architecture to an entirely new EV architecture. I know this because I'm an EV driver. Under the old regime, let's call it, in the pandemic, we saw enormous supply chain disruptions where OEMs, because they didn't control the supply of a 50-cent semiconductor component, was unable to sell a vehicle. What does that mean from a DOT's point of view? It's absolutely terrible. Why? Because we need to see a constant regeneration of the new vehicle fleet. It improves vehicle safety, it increases fuel efficiency, and it just does good things generically from an economic point of view in the United States. We're now going from a scenario where we saw tremendous disruption because we didn't control 99% of the supply chain to a new architecture where we essentially control 0% of the most critical supply chain. What are we going to do about it? I understand that you've been answering these questions on the stage, but does anybody understand the true implications of what we are doing?
I do, and I have some thoughts on it. Okay, so first of all, I think the fundamentals around buying an IC car and a battery car are fundamentally different, right? An IC car is much cheaper to buy up front, whereas a battery-powered car is much cheaper to operate. Fundamentally, we have to change the paradigm on how the business model for which people buy and own cars, right? So my 26-year-old sister-in-law actually just rented a car, a Tesla, for a year. There's like a new company. She wanted a Tesla. It was like a 7-month wait. Then she thought, it's a lot of money. Oh, actually, I could just rent it month by month for a year, and it's way cheaper. So I think the paradigm on how we think about the business model of like vehicle ownership fundamentally needs to change. And we need to support those companies with capital so that they can build that platform, right? It takes time to get to scale, to get to profitability, and the IRA fundamentally supports manufacturing, it supports the generation of clean electricity, but does it support financially those businesses that are building that new business model on how people are going to own and operate electric vehicles. That's my thought.
And I would just say the second part of that I would say is also not only does the MSRP not really give you an apples to apples, I also do think we need an all of the above in terms of transportation solutions because vehicle ownership as a default is probably not a sustainable way, at least at the city level, and maybe at the national level it can work, but vehicle ownership at the city level, you certainly want to make sure your residents have options that don't just involve, if I don't have access to a car, I don't have access to economic mobility. And that's where I think e-bikes and other things can be a pretty big part of the picture in terms of economic access to opportunity and mobility. I think we are at time basically, or do we have time for one more question?
We have one more question.
All right, time for one more question. Megan?
Hi, Ariel Horowitz from the Mass Energy Center. I might ask sort of where I thought that question might go, which is something like 2/3 of vehicle purchases are purchases of used vehicles. So what do we do with the used vehicle market, which right now the EV used vehicle market is super thin. We're talking about battery lifetimes, battery reclamation. What do we do, especially for commercial vehicle owners, which again, it's a very heavy used vehicle market, especially for smaller businesses. What do we do with the used market?
My quick response would be if we're looking 25% EV penetration in 2030, the ICE engines are going to be around for a long time. So there'll be a sunset. I think resale values will probably drop though, so maybe it's less lucrative if you buy an ICE vehicle now, and that's probably not a bad outcome. Sorry, that's a thin.
Yeah.
I'm sure Steve's got.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll see that, as the EV market grows there and the fleet starts to turn over, there's going to be that incentive for creating, creating the infrastructure to refurbish cars the same way you do with ICEs right now. You're probably going to need to be able to replace the batteries. You're going to have a large aftermarket on replacement batteries for reasonably popular vehicles, and the pack vendors will keep their packs on the market as long as people are buying them in the aftermarket and it's still profitable. So, all of that's going to have to come up as EV penetration grows. But again, as long as the economic incentives are there, as long as people want to buy those used cars, and presumably they will, then it should be basically a matter of bringing up service centers and continuing production of the products long enough to basically have those spare parts in the aftermarket.
I would say, especially as it relates to not necessarily passenger cars, but medium-duty trucks and heavy-duty trucks, the EV retrofit opportunity is ginormous. You just, if you look at our climate goals, we do not have enough capacity in the likes of Volvo, Daimler, et cetera, to, even if they turned on all of their factories today on the heavy-duty side towards zero emissions, it wouldn't be enough. And so there's an entire fleet of medium and particularly heavy-duty trucks, purpose-built municipal vehicles, all this stuff, that absolutely are going to have to go through that EV retrofit process, and that's an entire class of sort of work that we don't necessarily have a robust chain for, except maybe at the classic car sort of level. And so there's a huge business opportunity there. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been really great. I think we're now going to be going to tables, so opportunity for further discussion. So thank you very much, everybody.